Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to Maritime Conversations. I am Srikant Kesnur, your host for this episode. Today, we are delighted to host a very distinguished guest to speak on a range of issues pertaining to geostrategy, geopolitics, and maritime affairs in our region. I am joined by Vice Admiral Sanjay SJ Singh, the Director General of United Service Institution. Now, Admiral SJ Singh has had a very distinguished career in the Indian Navy, a topper right from his initial days. He is the winner of the Sword of Honor for our course. He subsequently topped the long navigation course, and he also topped the Staff and Command College course at Shrivenham in United Kingdom, which has a whole cohort of international students. He's had several sea commands, which has culminated in the command of the sword arm of the Indian Navy, the Western Fleet. He's also been actively involved in the training domain. He has headed the Navigation and Direction School. He has headed the local workup team. Subsequently, he was the flag officer sea training. He's attended prestigious courses, including the National Defense College. Most importantly, from our perspective, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to flag a couple of things. First, he has been our naval attaché in Tehran, in Iran, and that was at a very crucial juncture in the history of that region, and we'll be talking about that. He's been there for 3+ years and has a very rich knowledge of that region. His PhD, incidentally, he is also a scholar warrior with a string of academic degrees. His PhD has been on that subject. Second, most importantly, he has been well known in the Indian Navy as an academic of the highest repute. He has steered the writing of India's maritime doctrine in 2008 and maritime security strategy in 2015, which are considered as our capstone documents. And of course, he's also written a very wonderful photo essay book about the Indian Navy in the 21st century. Third and most important, his final 2 appointments as a flag officer, as a vice admiral, where as the vice chief of naval staff and the flag officer commanding in chief Western Naval Command, where he was at the very apex of naval decision making and operations, including Operation Sindhu, about which we'll be talking. So he brings in a very rich canvas of experience, and he ticks all the boxes of being a thinker, doer, scholar, warrior, academic, and currently as the Director General of USI, he has a ringside view to strategic affairs and various issues happening in the capital. I'm sure you've seen him quite frequently on TV and YouTube shows in recent times. So welcome to Maritime Conversations, Admiral Sanjay SJ Singh. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Srikant. It's a pleasure to be back with you online again.
Yes, lots of happy memories of these online conversations. Admiral SJ Singh, to get on with our conversation, I would like to first, of course, I'd like to focus on what's happening in West Asia region now. But I'd first like to begin by asking your views about how you saw phase 1. By phase 1, I'm not referring to the 13-day war or the 12-day war of last June, but of what happened between February and June this year, of epic fury and whatever, True Promise and Roaring Lion and all that. So how do you view what obtained in phase 1 at the end of it, both from operational issues, from strategic issues, the outcome? You can tell us a bit about that, so that forms the background of what we are going to discuss subsequently.
Thank you, Srikant. And I take it that you don't want me to go through this sequence of events, but rather try and step back a little bit and see which way it's unfolded. Uh,
Yeah.
the fault lines between the principal actors, that are the United States and Iran and Israel, have been deep for the last 4 decades. Uh, there have been portions in history, ironically, when Iran and Israel have actually cooperated as United States. Go back to 1986, go back to the Iran Contra of buying arms and using them in Nicaragua. There obviously was a lot of interaction prior to the Islamic Revolution. But
Yeah.
since then there has been a very sharp animosity where there has been tactical adjustments, but strategic, clear, adverse outlook towards each other. And Iran has lost no opportunity to keep labeling United States as the great Satan and calling for the removal of the Zionist regime. Uh, the way the Israel's core function and principles that they are, and trying to push back to say towards democracy, though there have been some of the leaders who've been talking of removal of Israel itself. In the backdrop of all of this, for the last 2.5 decades, the issue of Iran's nuclear program has frequently been trumpeted by both the United States and Israel as a very serious threat to international peace and security. Iran, on its parts, has been trying to downplay the role that the AQ Khan black market nuclear Walmart had in kickstarting their nuclear program and portraying it as purely as a civil enrichment program. Be that as it may, through these last decades, there have been ups and downs involving the IAEA looking for an off ramp, looking at places where they could strike a deal. And eventually they did strike a deal in 2015. And Iran made an offer of being under strict inspections, accounting for every bit of nuclear material, only to have 3 years later, the Trump 1.0 administration reneging on that deal and leaving them completely in the open. Now, last year, when you had the second round of where major strikes were carried out against Iran's nuclear facilities, there are many people in the United States who have come on record to say there is no way any of those nuclear facilities can be restarted without the United States being aware of it, nor can any material be taken out. This includes earlier this year, you had General Petraeus has come online and said this. You had senior administration figures have said it. The question that comes back is, what is this war all about? Because the stated aims have kept changing. The stated aims for the United States was with nuclear. Then it shifted to removing the Islamic regime. Then it shifted to opening the Strait of Hormuz, which was open before the war had started. Similarly, Israel has been talking about for the last 20 years that Iran is 2 weeks away from going nuclear. Well, that 2 weeks has stretched to 20 years and still remains 2 weeks. What exactly were the political strategic war aims? There is lack of clarity. One can only assume that there was an assumption on both US and Israel side that the Islamic regime would fall and collapse. It's just one push at the right time and they're fragile. But that's not how the Iranian nation, civilization, government, and the armed forces have evolved themselves in the last 4 decades. In the last 4 decades, they have recognized that their principal threat to them for their survival and independence and sovereignty is from military strikes by the United States, because that was the world superpower. So they've been preparing for it through all this time. Now, take that as the backdrop and see the last 3 months how it has unfolded. Iran was prepared for a strike. They were caught by tactical surprise, but strategically they were not surprised. They've been preparing for this for 2.5 decades. So they had planned for the asymmetric warfare doctrine. They had planned for active defense doctrine. They had planned for decentralized execution, taking into account that the leadership may be either incapacitated, decapitated, or not even be in a position to pass on communications. So they fought a war of survival and existence, brutal, robust, tremendous tactical surprises all around. Militarily, there's no doubt of the superiority that the combined might of the United States and Israel had. But there is also became very evident that there is no way they could attain any of their politico-strategic stated aims in the manner that it was. So Iran's fighting back, harping on law, being careful and nuanced both in diplomatic terms, strong and robust in their defense and in asymmetric warfare to try and raise the cost of the victory to the United States and Israel, finally led to a position where there was no way out but to call for a pause and seek a negotiated solution. Now, in any negotiation, the challenge still comes into what is the give and take. There is no negotiation if one side gives and the other side takes. It has to be from both sides. And throughout this period, both sides had a feeling that they had the upper hand. So, hence, there was this constant slight movement up and down to say that at what point will you agree? And with a tremendous amount of diplomacy, with a great amount of statesmanship, they came at the end, as you said, of phase one to a position which seemed to have been fairly balanced, which afforded a chance for everybody to get off the ramp, try and limit the damage, and find a way, accommodated way forward. There are any specific queries on that, but that's how I would put in a nutshell what are the backdrop and how's phase one evolved and where we were at the end of phase one.
I think you have sort of highlighted a lot of points, and I'll sort of come back to that one way or the other. But from what I see, you suggest, and I guess this has been the opinion of most geopolitical experts, that for all the combat power and military superiority that the US and Israel had, Iran could not be subdued, and finally they had to come to a pause and negotiations diplomatically. Second, you pointed out how military objectives that US and Israel had set out to sort of get ultimately proved iffy or somewhat, hazy. And you also brought out the clarity that Iran had in their fight for survival, as also in suggesting that they had been preparing for it for a long time. So, notwithstanding the tactical surprise relating to the time or amount of air power put in the initial days, they were, in a sense, strategically prepared for this. So that brings me to my second question before I go to the third, and part of that also relates to the Strait of Hormuz, on which or about which Iran has this very, very proprietarial sort of take, if you can say that. Now, many of us who have sometimes sailed past that, we realized even in most peaceful times how Iranian ships would buzz you, come close to you if you traverse through the Strait of Hormuz. So I wanted to ask you, one, partly from a maritime dimension in relation to the waterways, and second, in an overall context, and this is where I want to come to your time as the naval attaché in Iran. Fill us a little bit on the strategic culture of Iran. I mean, obviously, you brought out civilizational aspects, a long historical memory, but a little bit more on the strategic culture, the thinking, that obtains in their higher echelons of power, military, security, defense, IRGC. Give us a bit of insight into that before we go to the third question.
Sure, I'll do that, Srikant, and remind me later to discuss a little bit about the technicalities of the Strait of Hormuz. The name being Strait of Hormuz and historically being after Hormuz doesn't mean that it's proprietary to Iran. And
Yes, yes, of course.
we'll come to some of those parts later. Now,
Yeah,
looking back at the Persian or the Iranian strategic culture,
yeah,
this is a country and a civilization that prides itself on its roots.
yeah.
It's been for the last 2000 years the center of art, science, and literature. Remember in the 14th and 15th century when Europe was going through an industrial revolution and renaissance, at that time Persia was in full bloom. The official court language in India for 600 plus years was Persian. Uh,
Yes,
this was the center of, as I said, art, science, and literature. Now, Iran remembers that very strongly. The one factor that changed all through this was the theocracy, the bringing in of the judicial, uh, rather religious jurisprudence, as they call it, the control of the clerics in being both the religious leaders as well as the temporal leaders in governance. And the concept of the Islamic Revolution, when the revolution took place, it was not only Islamic Revolution. All parties who were opposed to the monarchy and the Shah's policies, you had the Islamists, you had the communists, you had
yes,
third
you had the
parties as
communist
well.
too.
But
Yes, you had the communist.
post the fall of the Shah, the ones who prevailed were those who were aligned to the Islamic regime. Now, That doesn't, when the Islamic regime may have been born in 1979, the Persian civilization is thousands of years old. The thinking doesn't change. The level of knowledge, intelligence, culture, focus has always been there. Now, in the last 40 years, as a matter of choice, they, going back into the even modern Iran's history, the 1953 attempts as nationalization of the oil company, the CIA-sponsored coup with support from the UK in the fall of the very popular Prime Minister Mossadegh, there was a very healthy distrust of the Western powers. Now, here is a contradiction in terms. Iran, in trying to be modern, is becoming more and more westernized. That westernization movement is what led to the opposition from the Islamists. At the same time, the Islamists did not want to let go of science. But in a geopolitical sense, it was perhaps necessary for them to keep their distance away from the United States in particular. And whether by design or by default, that happened with the student takeover of the American embassy and the siege that
Embassy.
followed for a
Yeah.
year and a half. Yeah. And since then, the two pillars of the Islamic regime pulling in slightly different directions. One, an endeavor to modernize, reform within the overall contours of Islam, yet remember the maximum independence to the people in any other Islamic regime was actually what we were seeing in Iran through these decades. The individual rights, women voting, women driving, overall science, the emphasis on adult education, the emphasis on science and technology. So on one hand, there was a constant push towards modernity, but within the bounds of uh, the, the interpretation of the Islamic guidelines. On the other hand, geopolitically, a push against the United States and the West, calling them the great Satan, calling constantly for deaths to America, deaths to Israel, attempts at exporting the Islamic revolution to others, which is what led to pushback by everybody. And that since then, they have been constantly going through wars, fighting for survival, developing their own tactical and strategic solutions to the challenges that they were facing. So when you look at Iran, you're looking, today's Iran is a very complex government and society. On one hand, they are at the pinnacle of achievements. On the other hand, they're fighting for survival. So you have, if you talk of India being complex, and you can take the whole of India and compress it. India is 140, crore people. You condense that into less than 100 million people, and that's Iran for you. And I mean that from the point of view of the diversity that exists. You know?
Yeah.
So you will have, in a typical Iranian, you will have the intelligence of the Tamil Nadu or Andhra Pradesh. You will have the culture of Lucknow. You will have the debating skills and intellectual caliber and arts of Bengal and Kerala. You will have the large-heartedness and fighting spirit of Punjab. You will have the business acumen of Gujarat, and many more all rolled into one. So it's a very complex lot of people in society who are highly advanced at one level and extremely rigid, uh, emanating perhaps from their experience and from the fight for survival on the second side. So you have, uh, very interestingly, the NATO talks of mission command, but mission command is inherent in the Iranian culture. Uh, Once the larger direction is given, all the execution is left down the line because they have educated their people, they have trained their people. There is an inherent understanding of what the commander's intent. The execution is absolutely decentralized. So, in a sense, that what the West has got surprised by in this war of mosaic defense, it is inherent to their culture. The larger intent has been taken that these are the variations, these are possibilities, you prepare for all the possibilities, and down the line, everybody knows what they're supposed to do if things go wrong instinctively. Now, in this, of course, again, there is a slight division in the complexity of what you call the typical Persian diplomat, the Persian strategist, and the IRGC. The IRGC have grown out of the battlefields of the Iran-Iraq war, out of the battlefields for supremacy of the Islamic regime, or the battlefields because they were the core of forming the Hezbollah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they have come out with a very strong view and very strong convictions that there is no scope for diplomacy or negotiation, that finally the regime lasts because of them on their shoulders and their blood has been built up. And they've got this very firm belief that in the end of the day, there is going to be some sort of a huge standoff and they will prevail. And as per their culture, if they don't prevail, they're ready to be martyred. So in a sense of when you have this strategic game, and they call it the strategic game of chicken, you say finally the sheer power that exists on the Western side, they know they can't overcome that power. So it has to be contested through two or three means. One I mentioned was when I said active defense. Now the active defense doctrine was formulated more or 25 years ago, where they realized that they have to prevent the war from happening on Iran. So hence you need proxies. You need to enhance those proxies. You need to light the fire in other areas which are where the US interests and US bases lie. Now look back at the last 25 years and you don't see that happening all across east and west and southwest of Iran. And the second is asymmetric warfare. They very well were aware that in a stand-up fight, the power on the other side is overwhelming. So you need to create asymmetry. You need to create asymmetry in key places to raise the cost of victory to the United States. And hence their investment in drones, their investment in missiles, the investment in precision technologies. That is the asymmetric warfare. The focus that finally you can apply disproportionate pain. You're ready to go through pain. Is the other side willing to go through a proportion of that pain? And how do you increase the proportion of pain beyond what the West is willing to accept? So Strait of Hormuz was central. There's strong reasons, and I believe that they, at least for the last 25 years, and it was a fatwa of the deceased Rahbar, who said no to nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons did not suit their strategic culture. They were the prevalent force. The only other military force in the region that could balance Iran was actually, and even now remains, Turkey. Nobody else. Now, if they go nuclear and the other countries, the Arab states, go nuclear, that edge of theirs gets lost. So there's no reason for strategically for them to go nuclear, but to use the nuclear card for driving the grand bargain where they can get the strategic space that they demand for themselves and they perceive for themselves as a great culture. So you've got a mix over here. You hold the nuclear card without wanting to go nuclear, but use it to leverage. The other side uses it to leverage exaggerated fears of your going nuclear to raise the threat. So you counter that threat by lighting a fire in that region. Now you see the kind of complexity we are talking across over here. And then to deal with it all, the main strategic posture is a game of strategic chicken. We'll hurtle at you at full speed. We are ready to collide and die. Are you? And that's exactly what you see playing out now with the IRGC. They're ready for this day. They fought bravely, they fought hard, they've taken hits, and they're ready to come back fighting. And as a recent statement has just been made, that by the IRGC ground commander, I think it's the regular army, Atish ground commander, he says, we are ready to fight to the last drop of blood. Subtext, is the other side willing to do so? So for Iran, it has changed. They fought a war of survival. They won the war of survival. I would say phase one was a victory, clear victory to Iran. You've called it on the other side that the outlook was mixed up. I'm on record to have called it Operation Epic Fuzzy. If anybody thought that you can actually go into this operation and remove the Islamic regime through military strike alone, and that to do it in a couple of weeks on the cheap, well, I think they were ignoring all their own experts. And it's more a case of that you're picking and believing what you wanted to believe instead of cold hard analysis. So round one was very clearly won by Iran. They've stood off a combined power of US and Israel. They defeated the larger political strategic aims. They've countered them militarily. They held their ground, and all of it is absolutely as per the Iranian psyche and strategic culture. And they've held off till now, till 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So you've laid a kind of perfect ground for us to discuss round two. And I'm I want to just sort of for our viewers and listeners re-emphasize some of the points you made. I liked the way you sort of compressed all the qualities and compared it, made an analogy with different strengths of different people in India to illustrate the complexity of Iranian people. I also rather sort of like the way you seem to suggest that while Iran welcomes scientific and technological modernity. It does not view social and cultural modernity in the same way that the West views. But you also brought out in a larger sense that they are sort of very, very willing to wait, active defense, their proxies, also a kind of asymmetric way of waging war, active part of their strategy. I was fascinated with the way you sort of, brought out the nuclear signaling aspects, that they're playing the card, they're leveraging the card to suggest that they need to have that capabilities without probably necessarily wanting to them, but keeping the West in a state of uncertainty and panic. And above all, you brought out their ability to bear pain to the last man. In some ways, probably reminiscent of what Vietnam did a few decades ago. So, but that sort of segues, Admiral, to the next question. Now, you have very clearly said that round one, at least in terms of strategic outcome, went to Iran. Lots of people believe that for all the military might. Ultimately, if the West is promising $300 billion aid and in reconstruction and sort of going back without having achieved any of the aims, probably Iran had it good. But just within a few days, 8th of July, the ceasefire gets called off. In the next few days, Strait of Hormuz is closed again from Iran's side. US, sort of says the blockade is back. And while India's attention is elsewhere on domestic things, they start attacking each other's targets and installations, including the war spreading into the countries in the Gulf region. Now, having had an advantageous outcome of round one, I mean, ultimately, if the question is about survival or fighting for another day or waiting or probably prospering as they want, have they sort of overread, overreacted, and probably, overstretched themselves in this round two, their attacks and Hormuz, bringing back the attention of global community and arguably not winning the goodwill of too many people. I mean, if you do that on the Hormuz, well, like I said, my follow-up question would be on the technical aspects of the Strait of Hormuz and blockade and all that. But do you feel that they've bitten off more than they can chew? And round two, frankly, should not have happened. And what is happening now may turn out to be disadvantageous for Iran, even if it is going to fight till the last man. How do you view what is happening in round two at this point of time?
I agree with you, Srikant. I think they've overreached. I think they've made, in my view, a strategic error. Now look at a few parameters that we saw throughout round one. There was complete unity in Iran because they were fighting for their survival. I mean, you've got the Americans going across and bombarding civilian infrastructure, including that terrible, killing of 168 school children.
School children.
In indiscriminate at very places, while there will be errors and collateral damage in war, but you expect the world superpower and leading power to have been more circumspect, more careful in some of these activities. On the other hand, you found Iran was very, very careful through it all of remaining on the right side of law and international law. There's only one instance that I recollect where they've opened fire on a merchantman, and that was an Indian vessel. And that was after having given warning shots, and they did not sink it. They just damaged it very slightly and turned it back when it was trying to cross through the Strait of Hormuz, through Iranian territorial waters and trying to turn back. And they kept to the line of law. They did not declare a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. They stuck to everything within law. That means it was largely done to make sure that the domestic opinion remained rallied, one, as a matter of survival. Second, when you talk of just cause and just means, they stuck to both of them throughout round one. And the Americans, for all their power, were found wanting in each of these issues, including the targeting of 3 merchant vessels well outside the Strait of Hormuz. One of them was, in fact, at anchorage in Omani territorial waters when they hit it, killing of 3 Indian crew on that occasion. That's exactly at the time the ceasefire was called. Now you have the Strait of Hormuz. Again, even when they talk of excising toll on the Strait of Hormuz, they're very careful in sticking to the legal parlance. As per the IMO, and briefly, since you're speaking of the technical aspects, the Strait of Hormuz is divided between Iranian territorial waters and Omani territorial waters. Now, as per UNCLOS in international straits for transit passage, there has to be one transit navigational passage that is provided in consultation with the IMO, and that has been provided. That is your main traffic separation scheme, at least 80% of it which lies in Omani territorial waters. Only a very small portion of it, I would say maybe 10% of it lies actually in Iranian territorial waters. When the threat that these straits have been mined, the traffic separation scheme has been mined, which Iran, very again, with great sophistication, washed their hands off and said, we don't know if it's mined. If it's mined, we don't know where the mines are lying. We have no knowledge of it. And that was enough to put the fear into all the marine insurance companies. So they were now forced to divert. Now, south of the traffic separation scheme, the navigable channel is very narrow, as you're aware. It's about just 3-4 miles, where you still have over 25 to 30 meters of depth of water. The rest is all rocky. But north of the traffic separation scheme, you continue to have deep waters. All of that north of the TSS was Iranian territorial waters. So when they started providing an alternate channel for ships to move, and then said, we are providing you security, we are providing you services, in return of which we are charging you cost of services. Now, while it may be, one could argue to say it is contrary to the spirit, but legally, the letter of the law, they were very clearly within it. So when they spoke of charging tolls in future, which is colloquially, the Iranians didn't use the word tolls. They spoke of management of services. They're again very nuanced in terms of the law, and said, if you're passing through our territorial waters, you're not choosing to go through the IMO clear traffic separation scheme. I have to coordinate it for you. I have to send ships to escort you. I have to ensure your safety and security. Then you need to pay for it. All well so far. Now, when they struck the MOU, and the agreement was that the Strait of Hormuz will remain open. Now, here is where there seems to be a slight difference in interpretation or aspiration on the two sides. Ships passing through Omani territorial waters remain Oman's responsibility. That is also a passage of much smaller, lesser navigable passage than the passage through the original TSS or north through Iranian territorial waters. They started targeting merchantmen brazenly and openly, which are passing through Omani territorial waters in the period of the MOU and the ceasefire, stating that this is contrary to the MOU. MOU, Oman is not a party to it, IMO is not a party to it, UNCLOS is not a party to it. Now, that's the stage at which, in my view, they cross the very careful line they had been on the right side of when they start targeting innocent merchantmen. When the United States start targeting innocent merchantmen, India has also stood up and lodged protests. Now, when Iran for the first time started targeting, they targeted one. In a space of 3 or 4 days, they targeted about 5 to 7 ships and used force and claimed the use of force and said, we will not allow anyone to go through. You're not talking of not allowing passage of innocent third party through Omani territorial waters based on the MOU. Now, that's where I say they crossed the legal line. Now, second is the strategic line. Is this something that is going to be acceptable to all the world, which till now has been, while not coming out in favor of Iran for realpolitik reasons, have not been endorsing the US actions either? You have had a studied silence by most countries, and even where the traditional allies have voiced support, the support has been far muted than any time in the past where US has had conflict. You had division in the West, in Europe, with countries coming out in favor of Iran and anti-United States. Now, once you start targeting innocent merchantmen, contrary to UNCLOS in Omani territorial waters, all that goodwill, that careful balance that had been built up, now gets countered. Now, it depends what were your strategic aims. That means your strategic aspiration of whoever has carried out those strikes, whether it's Iran as a whole or it's some sections within the polity which are divided, is that we will not allow any passage through anywhere in the Strait of Hormuz, and we lay claim, like Ashwamedha, to all of these waters without our permission. That's a bridge too far. That's a claim too far. That's not going to be accepted by anybody. Now, in response to that, straight away, you've had the United States carrying out 2 weeks of brutal strikes, targeted but hard-hitting strikes. Remember, the original round was estimated by Iranian sources to say they suffered $270 billion of damage.
Yeah.
Now add at least 25% more to that by now.
Yeah.
You're straight away talking of close to $500 billion of damage. How long will
Yes.
it take you to recover from that? Now, the first time around inside Iran, it was a war of survival. There was no choice. They were fighting for their survival. But once having achieved a ceasefire, to now open the second round, while Iran is blaming the United States for having broken the ceasefire, but the use of force was by Iran against innocent merchantmen. Somewhere
Yes.
along the line, somewhere along the line, when the dust settles down and people start looking at it, whether in history or as strategists, they're going to say, was this second round opening the ball in Iran's larger interests? Or could you have allowed that small portion of traffic, which at best would have constituted between 10 to 25% of the traffic, allowed it to go through? Yes, it would have been a loss of control, but what was the strategic aim over here? And or is your strategic aim overreaching to say you have actually won the war? You won the political strategic phase one, not the war. If your entire aim for 25 years was to avoid getting into a one-on-one attritional war and was to operate in an asymmetric manner and maneuverist, then you've given that up and you've taken a direct confrontation with everybody in the Strait of Hormuz to say, I lay claim to the whole of Strait of Hormuz, which is never going to be accepted. Now, whatever damage occurs after this, when the strategists look back and they're going to say, was this opening of the second round necessary and essential for Iran's strategic aims? No, no, not the aims that you had in phase one, not the aims that they've had for the last 25 years of buying themselves strategic freedom and autonomy by imposing deterrence. That means now you're aiming for exercising full control. Now, either this is a gross miscalculation where you have overestimated your powers, or second, you change your entire strategic approach to say now we are going to replace the United States as a regional hegemon. Perhaps they have the power to do that. Time will tell. It doesn't look likely, but if that is the thinking, it's one of these two. One, either there is a complete miscalculation where you have overestimated your power and underestimated the power of the combined West and the rest of the world, or second, you actually have that much of power and you say, well, now the gloves are off. Now I don't need to limit my aims. Let me expand my aims and establish my suzerainty all across the West, all across the Western Asian region. In my view, I would consider this as a strategic mistake because I don't think that kind of power exists. The resilient power, while it's great and has been impressive the way they have fought and the way they have stood off, but they don't have the depth of economy. They don't have the depth of industry. They don't have the depth of resources. Unless this becomes a broader war and you have other people pitching in overtly on the side of Iran, which doesn't appear to be the normal, in which case, why open up the second round? Was it a bluff gone wrong? Was it a wrong estimation? Was it an internal division where once again now all the people remember who are advocating calm and diplomacy and countering the IRGC versus the non-IRGC, where the non-IRGC were able to employ the strength of the IRGC and commitment of the IRGC, but nuance it with very fine shatranj, chess play, strategic games of 5 moves ahead and nuances in each of those moves. That nuance, has it disappeared? Have the people who are able to apply the control now no longer able to apply the control? And it's purely the IRGC in front? I think time will tell. But in my view, Srikant, I think they've made a strategic error because now, whichever way I see it, the amount of damage that will be borne by Iran will be higher. The deal that they could have struck now and were on the verge of striking, that deal becomes more difficult. As the deal becomes more difficult, then you get caught into the negotiation trap. How can I negotiate for a lower price than what I could have got 2 weeks ago? So you'll try and recover that. Then it becomes the lost there's a word for it, the lost syndrome. The recovery of the lost syndrome, and it drags on and on. We saw the same thing happening in the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq. Uh, Iran had gained the upper hand by 82. By 82, when Iraq was offering peace, they could have sued for peace on very favorable terms. 6 years later, the final peace terms they accepted were lesser than what were available to them in 1982 at far greater cost. I see this as a repeat, that somewhere along the line, your ability to bring your ambitions down, control your ambitions, and go for a good deal. The ultimate art of the deal, which they've been grabbing. I think on this occasion, as they made in the 80s, they've lost a golden opportunity. They've cleared the pitch. And here on afterwards, because there is no way the deal that they're talking of controlling whole of Strait of Hormuz can be acceptable, not just to the United States, to anybody else, not to the Arab countries, not to anyone else. So whatever deal comes out at the end of this, of the round two and round three, because round two is temporarily paused, I have no
Yeah.
doubt with this continuation, with the lines that are so deep, and if you get to this to say, when I'm in a strong position, I will not negotiate, and when I'm weak position, I must not negotiate. So when do you negotiate? So that pitch has been cleared, and now whatever rounds come, the relative strength will keep changing. And inside Iran, there are going to be people who are going to turn around and ask and seek accountability to say, when it was no longer a matter of survival, why did you have to become more ambitious? You had won your aims. You had achieved your aims. Same thing happened in 82. They had won their aims. But now they want to teach Saddam a lesson and go for more. Same thing is happening right now. They have won it, they attained the aims, but now there seems to be a desire for more and say, I can get more out of it. Why should I settle for less? And that leads us into round two, round three, round four. At the end of it, which to my mind will take at least 3 months and could even last a year more, with staccato bits and pieces of tension going up and down, minor pauses to relieve pressure for everybody, float the safety wall all around, as we say in the Navy, and then get back to it. But at the end of all of this, day after tomorrow, what is going to be the situation? $500 billion of damage? In a year from now, $1 trillion worth of damage? How will Iran recover from that? What will be the scene inside? So I think strategically they had won, and I would call this having snatched victory out of impending defeat. I would call what is opened up around to an impending strategy of snatching defeat out of a short victory.
Yeah. So again, there are lots of very very wonderful point you made. One, of course, is the same. The goose that laid the golden egg syndrome. Have you sort of been a little too greedy, and therefore having won a victory, now are again on the verge of perhaps sacrificing the gains of that victory. Now, there are lots of points you made, and in round one, I think it's interesting how you brought out that while people were somewhat uncomfortable with Iran's proprietarial claim on the strait, there was a kind of, like you brought out, either realpolitik or some kind of sympathy for what was perceived as the underdog at that time, particularly given the global state of relations between Trump and the rest of his so-called friends in the West and all that. So there was a kind of, let's say, muted response to what should have been, seen as a kind of attack on global commons. At least that's the way I saw it, because everyone thought this too shall pass, and after the war, things will revert to status quo ante. But that's clearly not happened, and you have brought out how Iran might be both in terms of economic damage, in terms of infrastructural damage, and in terms of strategic miscalculation, and whether this is
And domestic political cohesion, which was
yes,
which was absolutely solidified and unified when it was a war of survival, which is not necessarily the case when it shifts and the war aims shift.
true, and whether this is a kind of little bit of a divide between the IRGC and the diplomats. I hope that it's only a miscalculation and not the other possibility that you said, that they want to be the regional hegemon, because then that will introduce the next set of complexities where their ambitions will square up against the desires and the requirements of other people in the region.
But
But
Shrikant, doesn't
yeah,
whatever be the reason, now with the what move that has been made, what their adversaries will point to is the risk of the second possibility. So the
yes,
so
yes,
the opposition to whatever was Iranian strategic aim, whether it was to be regional hegemon or it was to acquire a little bit more, either way will be portrayed in terms that are more inimical to Iran. So whether the truth was one or the other or a third, the likelihood that it will be portrayed as a serious threat to international peace and security centered around Strait of Hormuz, it becomes the more likely event right now.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that out, because in round one, particularly after the war spread to remaining parts of West Asia, there was a sense amongst many allies of the US that, allying with the US doesn't necessarily buy you security. Now it seems to have turned a bit, because if you can play on Iran's regional hegemonic ambitions, you can suggest that you're not safe either with Iran as the regional
Yeah.
hegemon. So you better go back to the American embrace. But now, moving a little bit from Iran, because as people in the maritime domain, uh, there is one is the international experts and geopolitics, but as people in maritime domain, this brought out a lot of issues, whether it was the sinking and targeting of IRS Dena, whether it was about the Strait of Hormuz closure, whether it was mining, whether it was bringing in an amphibious task force by the US, and also the US blockade. Now, you took a bit of nuanced view on this, a little different from what some other experts thought. So I'd like you to weigh in on that, but also, add to that. As I see, even in phase one, if you remember, Singapore foreign minister, a lot of other people contested what you called a claim too far, but they were willing to give that leeway and allowance. But now, if you have international waters being contested, if the Houthis get into the game in the Red Sea region, and if international straits are under this sort of strain and tension, then global shipping tends to get very uncomfortable and insecure, and at some stage that will play back to the decision makers on ground. So how do you see the future of the maritime domain? Is there going to be a greater crisis of supply chain management? How do you see both the technical views around blockade, ownership of the strait, targeting of a ship if you want, and its its sort of bearing on the larger maritime domain now, in the backdrop of this conflict?
Right. No, thank you, Shrikant. Look, there's no doubt that your supply chains have been disrupted. We've seen the fluctuating energy market. We've seen the effect on fertilizers, urea. It's like a blockage of the heart's artery, right? So the flow of blood in the veins has been badly affected, affects the health of the body. At the same time, smaller arteries take on when the main artery gets blocked. And you have a certain amount of mitigating measures that fall into place. And beyond a certain stage, the amount of pain that is there is getting adjusted, borne by everybody, while the growing resentment will be there to say, one, initially the resentment against the people who started it, and thereafter the resentment will shift to the people who are continuing to propagate and push it. So while you may have Iran blocking the Strait of Hormuz and their proxy, the Houthis, blocking the Bab al Mandeb, we already have been through this. The world has survived 6 months of this. The world has, in
Yes.
fact, survived 3 years of the Houthis trying to target the Bab al Mandeb. And
Yes.
you had 50% of droppage of shipping. The world survived. And people moved on because alternate arteries came up. So you had routes that were taking from 7 days to India, uh, outside the Suez, from Europe to India, increased by 7 days. From 14 days, it went up to 21 days. But the economy adjusted. Larger shipping started getting brought in, which could not go through the Suez, which had come in earlier as smaller shipping for better efficiency. The world went back to larger ships. So the loss of longer time and cost also got outweighed by the amount that you saved in transportation cost per unit by economies of scale. Now, the energy flow that has already got damaged in the Strait of Hormuz, some of it is probably not going to be restored for a couple of years, especially for, say, Qatar or Kuwait or some of the countries that have faced damage to their oil infrastructure. So whether the Hormuz is open or not, that damage has already taken place. So alternate sources of energy are opening up. The United States has ramped up a huge amount of export. Venezuela is trying to ramp up export. The restrictions on Russia that were put applied, it's a separate strategic discussion altogether. They opened
Yes.
up. So
Yes.
while there is being damage to global economy and global supply chains, it is not debilitating to the extent that the world will now turn around and bow down to the Iranian demands if
Yes.
they be absolutist in this term.
Yep.
So I would say this supply chain disruption is hurting everyone, but it has not been debilitating. The world has been able to adjust and manage, and as time goes by, they will keep managing. It will not go back for a couple of years at least to the way it was, but it's not as if it was a killer blow. Now,
Just to pause here,
yeah, yeah,
just to pause because you suggested that it is debilitating to while it's while it's debilitating to everyone. Uh, what I meant to ask you was, will it probably, if the world finds out alternative sources and ramps up other ways, will it hurt Iran the most in the long run if they
yes,
continue to do
absolutely.
that? Yeah,
Absolutely. That's what I meant by saying I feel that they have made a strategic overreach and a strategic error.
yeah,
Because when everybody is losing, remember, Iran's strategy was we are willing to suffer pain, are you?
yeah,
Now, every pain has a certain threshold. Now, in
yes.
the pain that they've imposed on the other side, they won round one. And the additional pain that they're trying to impose on round two, I don't think that much of pain they will be able to impose for the reasons we just discussed. But the return pain on them also keeps climbing up. And now that's where the question comes, will that pain be acceptable as the cost of reconstruction keeps rising? As the chances of strategic victory in round two, three, four, which have been opened up by Iran, recedes? What will be the internal dynamics at that particular stage? Will increasing desperation come in? Now, these are things which you have to watch over a period of time. All I'll say is the degree of cohesion, planning, professional execution, uh, strategic gaming, which we saw in round one, is seems to be absent in the way round two has been initiated. Now it's entirely possible that they recover, find a middle path, go back to something between less than the demand that they're right now putting out and take two, three steps back, get over the ramp. That would be the most sensible and strategic thing to do. But if they don't do that, then, as I said, the gains and position they were in, whatever their bargaining position, every few months keeps reducing unless they step back. And the challenge of stepping back in any deal is when you had a good deal and you go for more, and now what starts coming on offer is less than what you already had in your hand. Do you now have the sagacity? Do you now have the uh, cold mindedness to settle for lesser? Or, as we saw in the 80s war between Iran and Iraq, you will keep trying and keep going through more and more and more and more pain till you hit a stalemate point. And then, under those conditions, when it's adequately proved that you can't get as good a deal as you had, then you step back, make a virtue out of it. A lot of time has passed, the blame gets parceled around everywhere, and then accept that deal by saying you're drinking a poison of chalice. So that's the challenge I think that the Iranian strategists have at this particular point. The hardcore strategists vis-a-vis the military strategists, the political military strategists versus the military operational leader. I see that there is the cohesion and the smoothness which their strategy was unfolding, which we saw in round one. I see a difference in round two. Now, it's easily correctable. Is easily correctable by stepping off the points that they made in round two and perhaps having to accept a little bit lesser now than what they already were expecting to get at the end of round one. Would be the most strategic thing to do at this stage. Will they be able to do it? That is the key question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think since we both use sporting analogies, I think we are seeing the two innings play out differently, or the two halves of a hockey
Yep.
or football playing out differently. But the moot point is whether it kind of stays into two innings or two halves, or like a boxing bout goes on into many rounds and becomes a slugfest where nothing really comes out other than
And
to.
and remember, the Iran entire Iranian strategy was to avoid a slugfest. The,
Yes,
the,
yes.
the, the, the masterpiece of the strategy that unfolded in round one, which they've been practicing for 25 years, was to avoid an attritional war, was to avoid a slugfest, to fight maneuverist.
After this wonderful conversation, we are sure you'll want to hear more. While we are pausing the conversation here, stay tuned for part two, where we continue this fascinating discussion. Thank you.